Welcome to Beneath the Grandstand. I think this is Mark's episode 9, Alex. Is that correct?
Mm,
Almost
9.
double digits. Almost double digits.
Yeah.
We're getting old here. This is good. This is good. But yeah, back for another great episode. And it's been an interesting week as things more starts to develop, personally, with government and regulations and things going on, but also obviously in sports, which is what we like to talk about here. So Al, one of the things a couple of things I saw in the last couple of days, Olympics announced if for some reason the games cannot be held in 2021, there will be no Olympics which I assume means no Olympics until 2024. Pretty big news.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree. I mean, I haven't heard somebody come out against that proposition. I mean, at that point, when you start pushing things back that far, you start affecting the next Olympics in Paris. It would just be a total shame overall for the preparation and the overall facilities and the construction and just like if we go through all of this and we persevere and we're on the other side finally of Corona, whatever that looks like, and we still don't get to have this kind of like triumphant moment of having an Olympic opening ceremonies, that will be pretty crushing. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Thomas Bach said he's like, you can't just keep changing sports calendars and totally be able to keep adjusting like that. I mean, especially an event of this size. So anyway, it's interesting because that, right, for athletes, for brands, for sponsors, you're really fingers crossed that this thing goes off at this point. Some other news that was out there, the NCAA announced voluntary workouts to be, we're able to be held for football and basketball, men's and women's basketball. So those student athletes can essentially go back on campus. I think it's still restricted in terms of, how many athletes can actually be together. And then it's obviously subject to the local, state and regulations. But kids are allowed to start practicing with coaches. And that's a first that we've seen. The university side of all this is going to be really interesting, where some schools are still trying to figure it out. Some have announced they're going to have students back on campus. And I'm now hearing even that some students will have kids on campus through the summer and fall. But once winter comes around, they may actually go back to online classes where, because there's this thought of a virus, festering during flu season and coming back stronger. So it's really so much still up in the air on the college side.
What I get, kind of concerned with, and I'm sure this argument's been made, but it's like, hey, okay, so they put the ante up that says you can work out. Great, awesome. But you're still, some schools are still under the restrictions of the governor's specific, requirements. So, and then some kids and coaches and administration just might not be comfortable doing it overall. So cool, we've said that you can have it, you can have practices, but some people will and some people won't be able to. And don't tell me that doesn't create a competitive advantage, and you're going to have to weigh that on your morality scale, right? I mean, the first game comes so fast. Once the actual school starts, it's like the first weekend of school, we got games. And so I think those first couple weekends, there's some schools that are definitely scrambling, especially in this case because we haven't had spring ball for the football team. So it'll be interesting, and it puts administrations in a really tough spot because it's we want to get practicing because we don't want to be a month behind once the actual season starts. It's going to be tough, and I'm curious to see what the discussions are between each athletic director.
Yeah, and on the pro sports side, switching gears a little bit, one interesting thing I saw was from the MLS. The MLS is a soccer league here in the States that's trying to essentially put their teams in their league in a mini tournament in Orlando at Disney Wide World of Sports, and so taking all the players and personnel and having them essentially quarantine there together to have sports, right? And so a lot of the talk has been, how do we get sports going and when can they do it and how can they do it? There's revenue and TV contracts, a lot of financials attached to these decisions. But this week, some MLS players started speaking out and saying, hey, there's another side of this, and that's us, the players, that are being asked to essentially leave our families for over 2 months in this crazy time. And, home is where we have the comfort right now, right? That's what we know. That's the only like certainty we have is home. And so taking players away from their family, you're a dad, Alex, and, having to leave your wife and kid, it's a side of the conversation that just hasn't really been talked about. It's been mostly like, yeah, we want sports. How do we do it? And then you're like, oh yeah, there's individuals here that this affects that are the ones that we're relying on to actually play the sports.
Yeah, especially with the MLS, man. Like, at first when I hear the argument, like, oh, what about my family? It's like, look, man, like, it's easy to like think about professional athletes and be like, oh, you'll figure it out. I mean, you got it good. But in the MLS, it's not as glamorous. The kicks aren't as like sexy, and the actual athletes, like from where they come from and where their families all live, it's incredibly diverse. Probably the most diverse in our league or in any U.S. league. So yeah, it's tough. It's like, I want to see sports for sure, and I wonder, like, it's almost like we're not going to figure out all the puzzle pieces at once. So if we can at least figure out where we're going to compete and how we're going to compete, and okay, now we can start building backwards from that, and hopefully we find a situation where it's like, this is how we're going to see sports, and then we work backwards to like, and this is how your family like is able to join you in this journey. But it's going to get super hairy, especially with some of those MLS players, because they are, the immigration standards, I'm sure are a little complicated right now.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting as players speak out and more leagues are trying to figure things out like this. And, it'd be interesting to see how loud those voices get and if it really dictates any decisions. I mean, we obviously saw track and field athletes spoke out, and the Olympics, whether that was the ultimate impetus that made the Olympics kind of open up on making an announcement when they did. We know the athlete voice is powerful when it comes together. So it'll be interesting to see if others kind of rally around that sentiment and speak out, or if, what the percentage of athletes are that actually want to get back on the field to play. So, I think the other, one of the other things in sports we've seen, and this is now probably about 2 weeks removed, is a smaller brand, I should say, boutique brand, maybe a better phrase for it, within the running space, has gotten into sponsorship of some pretty well-known athletes. We're talking about Tracksmith and their announcement around Cain and Nick Willis. Really, again, a boutique brand that's been around for almost 7 years now. That's been really, it feels like it was about creating a brand almost before a product in some ways. Has been really, I would say, embedded in the running community. I was at the Boston Marathon in 2019 and was just amazed at how many people were out in the streets the days leading to, wearing it in group runs, wearing this Tracksmith gear. And now, kind of a stamp of legitimacy in a way when you have some folks of Cain and Nick Willis. And, Al, you come from the brand side. I mean, how did you take that announcement?
Yeah, pretty interesting. There's no doubt that there has to be a healthier way for brands to support athletes in a more direct way, right? And it's like they can't just be these contract vendors anymore. How do you give them like the sustainability and like the actual cornerstones of a career and a life that will kind of put some, I don't know, some comfort in their life and some something to lean on, a little cornerstone, and whether that be a paycheck that comes every 2 weeks instead of every 6 months, or whether that means, hey, this is your monthly insurance, like, and your whole family can be under it. It's kind of flipping the model on its head from that perspective. And I think that's what's really cool. And something that honestly, like when I was at Adi, like I would have, like, there were so many times that I thought to myself, well, why can't we just give these guys, why can't they just get on our health insurance plan? Think of how many runners would kill. Instead of just getting $100 a year every once in a while, like you know what would be great is if I had health insurance. And so we got to, obviously running is a lot different. And that's why Tracksmith is able to, kind of be nimble and create these innovative new contracts and new approaches. For me, I think like this will be a cool conversation because it's almost like a how I built this. And I know a lot of people love those podcasts, but when you saw Tracksmith and we've seen so many new brands. There's so many running brands, and everybody tries to kind of, every day you see an Instagram post of a new brand that you've never heard of, right? But this one had staying power. And like you said, Ryan, it's almost like they came to the table with a brand identity first. You can read Shoe Dog and be like, wow, they made this amazing racing flat and worked backwards from there into a company. But this was like they were serving a very specific audience, and they really leaned into the brand, and they just they stayed small and they grew small. And now it's this like really kind of amazing cult identity that, is almost, it's starting to sprinkle out into not just dorky runner culture. It's a brand with some staying power, and I'm curious to see where they go from here.
Yeah. And so our conversation today will all this really drummed up a lot of questions for us, and our conversation today, fortunate enough to have the CEO and co-founder of Tracksmith join us, Matt Taylor, to kind of hear the story of how Tracksmith went down the road it did, and how it got to where it is today, and kind of understand some of those dynamics a little bit. So I'd say, let's get into this conversation with Mr. Matt Taylor. We've known him for years, great guy. So let's welcome him onto the show. All right, we're happy to welcome today's guest, co-founder and CEO of Tracksmith, Mr. Matt Taylor, who's rocking that very nice quarantine beard and that beautiful scenery. Matt, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you? It's been a while.
I know, we're good. We, Alex and I both cleaned up our looks a little bit, and we appreciate you holding down the mountain man look out there in the forest.
Yeah, I don't have anything to shave for, so I thought I would give it a go and see how long it can get. So.
Well, the streak continues. Well, obviously the Tracksmith, you guys are out of Boston. I know you have your shop down on Newberry Street there. But where are you at today? What's the latest for you and the family?
Yeah, we're actually down in North Attleboro, which is sort of, halfway between Boston and Providence. My wife grew up down here, so it's her childhood home basically, and it's been sitting empty as her parents have prepared to sell it. So we decamped a few weeks ago, brought the kids down here. It's on beautiful farmland down here and really quiet and peaceful. So it's been a nice break from Boston.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, a lot of things we'd love to speak with you about today. So we appreciate you joining us. Obviously recent announcements with some athletes joining the Tracksmith name. But before we get there, I'm not sure how many people know your story and kind of where you started. I think there's some of the diehards in the running community that kind of remember the early Matt Taylor days. But Alex and I were talking, as we were coordinating with you to come on the show today, and the way I think of Matt Taylor is really kind of one of the first digital content creators within the space of running, right? And I remember when I joined FlowTrack in 2008 and FlowTrack started in 2006, I knew of this thing called Chasing Tradition, right? And this series that I think it was followed a number of Ivy League schools and told these stories. And I remember thinking like, wow, we're telling stories in a similar way to what we had seen even before FlowTrack had launched. So anyway, I don't know if you look at yourself that way or if there were other folks trying to do what you were doing in terms of telling stories. But those were the early days of that Chasing series. And maybe can you go into what that was and how you started that?
Yeah, I think definitely at the time, it felt pretty unique for sure. I think it was 2002 or 3 is when I started Chasing Tradition. And it was basically, I spent 1 week at 11 different NCAA programs. It actually wasn't Ivy League schools. I did one, I did Dartmouth, but it was mostly D1 schools. So I did, I don't know, Colorado and Portland, Georgetown, William and Mary, but then also did a D2, a D3, and an NAIA school. And so I basically spent 1 week at each school, lived with athletes on the team, documented their, training during the week, their lifestyle basically on campus. And, went from literally week 1 of the season all the way up to the NCAA championships at the end. And it was, I was by myself. I was doing video, photography, and writing, and all of them very average or below average. But at the time, that type of content didn't exist. And so for the people that were into, NCAA cross country, it was the only thing out there that existed at the time. So I had a very small but passionate audience. And for me, it was just like, a huge learning opportunity. I had a lot of like ideas going into it of what I thought people wanted to know and see. And predominantly I was thinking everyone wanted to know what splits did they hit in the workout. And, and really people wanted to know like what these athletes were doing in their downtime. Like, where did they live? What was their house like? Like what, and there were some great characters, right? This is going way back, but like Ben True was at Dartmouth. I think he was a sophomore, and, he's super charismatic, and it was fun sort of telling his story a little bit. And the guys at Portland back then were wild, and that was fun. So it was a great experience. That was a lot of fun.
Matt, I'm curious. I mean, I hear all these stories, and they ring, similarly to, some of the, the aspirations we had at Flow in the early days. But I know one of our biggest headaches was filming everything was fun, and actually creating the content was fun. But the hard part was getting it uploaded and putting it on an actual platform. What did that look like in your early days? Like because this was before you could easily just sling stuff on YouTube or anything. Like, what was the video platform back in the day?
So, funny enough, a friend of mine, my first job out of college was at IMG, the big sports management and marketing firm. And I left there, to start like a web services agency, with 2 other friends of mine. And it didn't work out. It was not a successful startup for me. But one of the guys was very technologically advanced and sound. And so I leaned on him and said, this is what I want to do. And so he basically built like a custom video upload tool. We hosted the videos ourselves, YouTube, I don't know when it started. I don't even know if it was around, but that wasn't an option. Vimeo wasn't an option, so I had a rudimentary blog. I was able to upload photos into a photo gallery, and I was able to upload the videos. So yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Very, very, very cumbersome process back then. I think I don't know if many people would know this name. I think we used blip.tv back in the day to upload our video.
Blip.tv. Yeah. I feel like in like a later project, I may have transitioned from like custom clunky video upload to Blip TV. I'm pretty sure I used that at some point.
Yeah, that was a big deal back then. I think we eventually graduated to like being able to upload videos directly to our own, website, and that was kind of a game changer. But yeah, it's like just so different. I mean, now you say I was a writer, a photographer, a videographer, and mediocre at both. I mean, today, I got the new iPhone 11 a couple weeks ago, and it's like I feel like my photography skills have literally just become decent because I have a camera that just does all the work for me, right? So it's true. It's a different day and age. But what was do you remember your the first project that you did of that series, and did you know what you were actually getting into in that first one?
No, I mean, I still remember the summer before the fall of that Chasing Tradition. So I did 1 season of Chasing Tradition. It was 11 weeks. And I remember like calling, cold emailing the coaches and, trying to get them on the phone. And, it's funny because we now know, right, in hindsight, some of the coaches' personalities, but literally back then you didn't really know because you guys didn't exist. You weren't doing these interviews. Mick Byrne was like on the phone. We were chatting. We became best friends. I love Mick. I went to Iona. Jerry Schumacher was probably the only coach that said no. You know, I sent him the email and he was like, I'm sorry, can you give me a little bit more information? And I know Jerry very well now. Totally. He's the sweetest guy in the world and one of the nicest coaches in the, you know, in the sport. But true to his brand, he was not interested in having someone, you know, hang out with his athletes. So it was definitely interesting to you know, just figure that stuff out on my own. And, you know, I bought a camera, laptop, flights, you know, basically just funded the whole thing myself, made some t-shirts to try to make some money back. And, you know, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And this actually, like, you know, from going from people not knowing what you were talking about, some coaches maybe not letting you in, this actually led to you starting to work with a pro sports agency, right? And Kimby Athletics. And, you know, I think probably the names that people know nowadays are, you know, Tom Radcliffe and Ricky Sims, who are two guys that came from the Kimby camp, right? When Kim McDonald was still with us. And, but that kind of led you to Kimbia. And if you can talk a little bit about how that chasing series evolved with Kimbia and the athletes that they had, and yeah, how did that domestic project lead you to what became international?
Yeah, so, you know, Tom Radcliffe, you know, I got to know him. I can't even remember, probably through Mick Byrne, actually, because he and Mick are good friends. And, you know, so Tom said, hey, would you be interested in doing something similar with my athletes? And he had at the time some of the best Kenyan marathoners in the world. And, you know, as you guys know, a lot of their stories and personalities weren't known. They were sort of, you know, they'd show up to races and not a lot of people knew the stories in the background. And so he wanted to try to, you know, showcase them and what they were doing. And so that was also an amazing experience. I you know, spent some time in Iten, Kenya, where they had a training camp, and then in Boulder, Colorado, and basically did the same thing. I mean, I lived with them, and I sort of was, you know, a fly on the wall and tried to document as authentically as I could what their lifestyle was, what their training was like, traveled with them to, you know, the major marathons, as well as some, you know, far off, you know, obscure marathons where, you know, they could maybe win and get a payday or get an appearance fee. And so, you know, I did the first season of that. And then Tom asked me to stay on and do another one. And then I eventually actually worked for Tom at Kimbia. And then we transitioned. So we were working with the Kenyans, but at the same time, Tom was representing, you know, Matt Tegenkamp and Chris Zielinski and eventually Evan Jager. And so Simon Byru. And so I started doing some work with them as well, mostly around their trip to Europe. So I would go to Europe with them to some of the meets, and again, just sort of document their experience there. And so that was also an amazing and fun experience.
What's the any takeaways that you remember from those years? I kind of look at those as almost like your content producing years, and kind of pushing the envelope in that coverage at that time. Any takeaways or learnings that you look back on that you still have today?
To be honest, kind of what I said about chasing tradition. I think what was really interesting is what people found the most interesting. You know, I think as in running, you know, I mean, we're not at the same caliber as the other professional sports, but people were really interested in the athletes themselves off the track, right? And as more and more information came out on the internet, you could find splits and workouts and race times, and that wasn't interesting anymore. And really, people wanted to know more about the individual. And so, you know, I think I again, like, I went into that with a very novice approach, but I think over the course of all of those projects, I learned a lot about storytelling and content creation. And, you know, I think I've, you know, been able to transition that later in my career, and thankfully be able to bring on people to the team who are much better at photography and film and writing than I am. But I think the lessons that I learned, and especially in a sport like running where there's not a lot of mainstream coverage, to just sort of figure out the nuances of what people were interested in, and how to present a story and present an athlete.
you kind of have, as hearing you talk, Matt, you kind of have this, you can tell there's an entrepreneurial piece of you that started early on, right? In starting your own thing, you were following the sport, following the athletes. You kind of made a pretty significant transition after that, right? You went and you actually worked for a large brand, which is much different than that entrepreneurial mindset that it sounds like you had. So, you transitioned after Kimbia to Puma, and just curious at how that developed for you, and what caused you to take that turn.
I mean, so I have been entrepreneurial. I've sort of had that bug for a long time. Just the way I grew up, my mom owned her own shop, was sort of a mini entrepreneur in that regard. My dad, who worked in the steel industry in Pittsburgh for a long time before that collapsed, had to sort of reinvent his career and did a lot of sort of like smaller entrepreneurial things. My brother is an amazing craftsman in Asheville, North Carolina, builds furniture and guitars and is, amazing. And so I just sort of always had that bug to do something. And, when I went through the chasing series from Tradition to Kimbia, I also did another one, Chasing Glory, during the 2008 Olympic marathon trials in Central Park. I learned a lot, but I also realized pretty quickly that I didn't have the skill set to really take that to, the next level, whatever that even meant. And so to me, when the opportunity at Puma came around, I really viewed that as like, okay, I know I want to start something at some point, but I just, I don't think I have the skill set to do that now. And I'll go to Puma, huge corporation, amazing brand, learn as much as I can. And when I feel like the time is right, hopefully we'll be better equipped to go out and start something on my own. I think starting a company, there's never a right time. But certainly sort of like post-collegiately, when you have very few responsibilities, or even in college, right? A lot of startups are founded that way. That's a good time. Or I think when you're a little further along in your career and in your life, and maybe have a little bit of stability that, you can take a risk. And if it doesn't work out, you have something to fall back on. So, at that time after chasing Kimbia, I just didn't feel like I was ready to sort of take that leap. So that's how I went into Puma and sort of how I viewed my time there.
Hey, Matt, I'm curious, while you were at Puma, it looks like you were there, in the heart of Bolt era. I mean, February, looking at your LinkedIn, it says February 2008. And that's just right on the cusp of the Beijing Olympics, when I think Bolt became a true cultural icon. And I'm curious to know, what was it like to be a part of a brand that all of a sudden really had a completely different momentum to it? And what was it like to be part of that momentum? And then what are some of the learnings you took from that you're now pulling into your new role?
Super lucky for me. I mean, if my LinkedIn says February 08, that's probably right. But I thought it was like the end of 07. But regardless, literally within a few weeks of starting that job, I flew to Jamaica. I met Usain, as well as some other athletes and coaches that Puma was working with. And I basically, one of the first projects I started doing was documenting Usain's training and lifestyle, the way I had done with chasing Kimbia and chasing Tradition. And so, we were, following him around and hanging out at the track and all of those things. And, I feel so fortunate. I feel like, it's going to take 20 years for me to really look back on that time and think how lucky it was, where in February of 2008, Usain was basically an underachieving Jamaican sprinter. He was not well known. He had not yet reached his potential, and actually had some, people thought he was lazy, didn't want to train hard. And really, Coach Mills, his coach, is the one who sort of was able to motivate him and transform him. And so when I started working with him, he wasn't a world record holder or an Olympic medalist. He was just a super talented guy who hadn't yet reached his potential. And so I still remember I think it was still called the Diamond League, but when he broke the world record in the 100 at Icon Stadium in New York, I was there with my video camera. If you actually look at some of the footage, I was like at the finish line, just past it with my little handheld camera. And he broke the world record, and nobody expected it. Certainly Usain and Coach Mills and his training partners knew he was super fit, but the goal was still the 200. And so that kind of caught the track world off guard. Didn't make really, major headlines outside of track and field. But then, Beijing happens a couple months later, and pretty much overnight becomes, in a global celebrity and an icon. So, I just feel super lucky and fortunate to have, basically had a front row seat to that rise. And then post Beijing, we traveled all over the world. And the next year in Berlin at the World Championships, he breaks the world records again, in the 100 and 200. And, so yeah, it was a wild ride, and very, very fortunate to have had a front row seat to that.
The timing is amazing, right? That's like, especially for, I forget what your age would have been at that time, but a young guy, you're still a young guy, look great, by the way. But a young guy that, falls into this role with this guy that really transcends track and field, right? And he is now on the list of probably the top 5 to top 10 names in sport globally. And how did that, after Beijing, how did things change for Puma, right? And what your day-to-day looked like after that, kind of media storm hit?
To be honest, it was a little challenging because, track and field is part of Puma's legacy for sure. But at that time, it wasn't a priority. And so, Puma as a brand has swung the pendulum of lifestyle and sport quite a bit, and, is swinging back again to performance side and doing some amazing things. But at the time, even post New York, pre-Beijing, there were only like 2 or 3 of us in the organization that were like, please listen to us. This guy has so much charisma. He can be a star. We think he's going to win in Beijing, and it was just really hard to get people to see what was coming. And then, post Beijing, these bigger companies can take a long time to react. And so it was certainly amazing, and Puma did a great job of, figuring out how to move him to the forefront of the brand's communication. We were much more around motorsports and football, soccer, at that time. And Usain slowly moved into sort of, the key brand communications, TV commercials and those things. But it was a struggle, and it took some time. And, if you know anything about product creation, in August of 2008, when he won in Beijing, the product team was already done with August of 2009. It's such a long lead time in terms of footwear and apparel. And so it did take a while to, get things going, but eventually they did. And yeah, it was obviously changed from Usain couldn't really go anywhere after that and not get, mobbed on the streets in really any city except maybe in the US. Track and field is much bigger in Europe, and so going to some of the Diamond League meets over there and doing appearances at our stores over there were kind of crazy. And in the US it was, but it's just not the same, or it wasn't at that time.
And it seems like for you guys, you're working for Puma, you're Bolt's, an athlete under Puma, but it's almost like you're managing 2 brands in a way, right? There's Puma, and arguably to some, I mean, Bolt in some ways is maybe the bigger brand. Yeah. And how did you guys manage that, and kind of what did you learn about managing that kind of athlete within a brand?
Yeah, it's very challenging in the sense that the predominantly running shoes and apparel are bought by distance runners, and then you had the greatest sprinter of all time, and so we struggled. I struggled. I wasn't in a position there that I was making the big decisions, but certainly I also was struggling with trying to figure out how to translate Bolt to product and storytelling that would resonate with distance runners buying performance running shoes. And so there were some like fits and starts there, and ultimately what we did and the way we thought about it is he really is a global icon for sport lifestyle. I mean, he was one of the most charismatic athletes in that era, and so you lean a little bit heavier into just general health and fitness as well as the lifestyle side, and let your sort of mom and pop running store. It was hard to make that connection, and so we just sort of had to maneuver a little bit with how we thought about him as an asset in running.
It's a very very unique experience that you got to have, not just your role at Puma, but just having the working relationship with again, a sportsman that will really transcend our time and be remembered for years. You had the opportunity to work with him after Puma, doing some things, but I guess when you look back at the entrepreneurial side of you look at what you learned at Puma and working with a sports brand, a running brand, and then this the athletes that you worked with. How and when did you know it was time to make a transition kind of back to that? What you talked about earlier is when is that time to start your own thing?
I didn't know, it wasn't a specific moment. I just sort of knew it was something I wanted to do. And I feel like starting a business, starting a company, timing is something that people don't talk a lot about. It's not just the idea and the execution, but just the timing of the founder's life. Where are they in their life that they can maybe take that risk or not? And got to a point where my wife and I, and actually at the time, I think our daughter had been born. She was maybe 1 or 2, something like that, and just felt like we were in a position where we could take that risk. She had a great job, and still does. She's an attorney, and so we felt like we had a little bit of the security to take that risk. So. But even then, I actually, I still didn't want to just sort of quit and start on Tracksmith, which I knew would take a long time to get to market. And given my working relationship with Usain, I actually convinced him to sort of, we built an iPhone video game. I don't know if you guys know that, but we launched an iPhone.
Downloaded.
Okay. Yeah. It wasn't the best game, but it worked. It worked for what we wanted. It was an iPhone video game that we launched a few weeks before the 2012 Olympics, and it reached #1 in the iTunes store in a lot of countries, not in the U.S. It made it up there, but it didn't get to #1 in the U.S. But so that gave me like the time. So I basically. I said, can we do this game together? Yes. We agreed on that and what the terms would be. And then I went out and found game developers because I didn't have that skill set. So I found some developers to build the game. I went out to Gatorade, who was a sponsor, and got them to come on board as a sponsor in the game. And, that provided enough money for me to, basically take a year to start to really work on Tracksmith and, use some of that money as startup capital to get the brand going. And so it wasn't sort of a like Puma ends and Tracksmith starts. There was definitely a year and a half or so in between there.
Matt, I'm curious, in that moment of your life, what was Tracksmith? Because most companies, it feels like it starts with they have a specific product that they think they can do better than everybody else in the market. But it feels like Tracksmith is a brand first. And I'm wondering, that seed that was in your mind that you'd been building, what was the actual opportunity? Where was Tracksmith going to go? And I guess, what was the final moment that you saw and knew that it was finally time to launch?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't what it was at launch. When I left Puma, I really started spending a lot of time researching the industry as a whole. So I was looking at, apparel and footwear, but I was also looking at media. I was looking at technology. I was looking at events, to just sort of see where I thought there was an opportunity. And as that process went on, I really zeroed in on men's running apparel. And, the reason is because it was the least resourced of the areas within the industry, right? Footwear was king for all of those brands. So the most resources, the best talent was going to that. And then women's apparel was growing pretty rapidly because of Lululemon and Athleta and some other brands. And so, within the apparel teams, women's became a priority. And so at the end of that, you had sort of men's apparel, and it all looked relatively the same in, 2011, 12, 13. They were all using the same fabrics. They were all literally the same colors. You would go look at the tech tees in the spring season. They were all orange. You'd go to the fall. They were all blue. The next spring they were yellow. So to me, that was, I would say, crystallized the vision for Tracksmith. You're right. It's much broader, and it's much more about the brand than it is about a single product. But my sort of strategy, and when I brought my co-founder on, our strategy was what's the path of least resistance to launch a brand, and it was via the internet and with men's running apparel. And we were able to launch a brand that was very distinct. It was visually very different from what existed on the market, and that was kind of our goal. How do we do something that can take hold really quickly? Will take a long time for the other brands to sort of react to and catch up, and that'll give us a head start to then start to build out, the rest of the brand. And we're obviously just scratching the surface, but it's been 5.5 years, and moderately successful so far. So we feel good about how we approached it.
Cool. Matt, you teased out your co-founder just a little bit there, and I'd love for you to dive into who he is and kind of his background, because I think for some of our running folks, it might crystallize a little bit kind of where Tracksmith might get some of its core identity.
Yeah, certainly. So Luke Skybler was my co-founder in the business, who I met sort of randomly. I cold emailed. There's no such thing as a cold call. I mean, I emailed him cold. He was involved early on with Rafa, the cycling brand based out of London. And so at the time when I reached out, he was just running his own creative agency in London. He had left Rafa several years before that, but was instrumental in establishing that brand early on. And, it started mostly as I was just pinging him with questions, and he was very gracious with his time. And as things progressed, we, sort of got more and more serious about those conversations, and eventually decided to partner up together. And he definitely helped from a brand identity perspective, and, thinking about the look and feel of the brand, but transitioned out of the company very shortly after we actually launched. We're still close to this day, but it was just one of those things. He was in London, and the company was being built in Boston. And, just operationally, once we got to like actually making physical product and operating a company, it wasn't the ideal scenario. So we had a amicable parting, but he was definitely instrumental in helping get the brand established at the launch.
It seems like you, in all your experiences, and as you continue at Tracksmith, you've been an entrepreneur that recognizes where you don't have the skill set, and either you're going to go learn it, or you're going to find someone that can help contribute to those areas that maybe you aren't as proficient in. mean, it seems like that has continued on.
That is 100% accurate. I have very few hard skills, but I think but I do think that is one of my strengths. I think is having a clear vision, but then finding people that can help me articulate and bring to life that vision. And Luke's a great example of that. Our photographer, who we've literally worked with since day one, and I think Tracksmith to a lot of people is the photography. That's visually how we present the brand in a very authentic way. Emily May has been our photographer literally since day one. She's probably done 98% of our photo shoots. Occasionally schedules don't align or whatever, but so that's a great example. I've just been fortunate to have super talented creative people in the organization, whether that's writers or designers, and so yeah, you are correct. I can't design, I can't sketch, I'm not good at taking photos or shooting film, but I've been able to get people excited and motivated around a vision. So,
Matt, I'm curious, you said before you guys launched, what it was initially, and then what it was when it launched became slightly different. Can you explain the initial thoughts and then what actually came to fruition?
I mean, it was once we got to what is sort of Tracksmith today, it actually hasn't changed that much. What I was referring to more is I really was looking at like some other opportunities, not apparel and accessories, technology and media and events. And so there were a lot of sort of iterations of how to enter running. And then once Tracksmith started, a lot of the original pillars they are what we are today. But, the name wasn't Tracksmith. We actually, it's funny because when we had we're 5.5 years, but when we hit our 4th year, I did like a big presentation to the company and went through the whole, founding story. And I dug up all the documents and, coming up with the name. I mean, it took us a really long time, but we were really thoughtful and considerate about it. But for a while we were Boston Supply Company, and we really thought that was going to be the name of the company. We lived with that probably for a month and a half, and then it just didn't feel right. We started creating the identity and putting it on apparel, and it didn't feel right. And so then we went to, I feel like it was maybe more of a joke, but we were Fishback for a while, there's this steeplechaser named Jeff Fishback, who was a really good steeplechaser and 2-miler. And so that was in the running for a while. And then eventually it was Tracksmith. And so yeah, it was less about it being, different in terms of the sort of main pillars that make up the brand. But yeah, the name and some of those things were, it took us a while to actually land on what we did. The iteration of like the logo, the rabbit, all of those things were, it's fun to look back on what the original direction of those were.
Curious, why did you land on the rabbit?
So the brand identity had a couple requirements from what we wanted. And one of them was we wanted to create a brand that felt like it had been or could have been around for a long time, right? So we didn't want something that felt super trendy and of the moment. So no ampersands, no Z's for S's, we wanted it to feel like it was something that could have been around for a long time. And Tracksmith, that ended up working. And when we looked at a lot of the brands that we admired that had been around for 50 to 100 years or more, a lot of them used animals as part of their identity. And at the time, we had reached out to a really great illustrator based in London. And he was a book illustrator, children's book, and sort of like an Alice in Wonderland style was his sort of illustration style. And so we said, I'm very fascinated by birds of prey. So we started looking at like hawks and falcons, but then also hares are, pretty aggressive and amazing animals. And bunny rabbits are cute and cuddly, but hares are like, they're kind of badass. And so anyway, he started sketching, and it immediately just hit on the, it looked great. And there's actually 3 versions of the logo. The one that UC that we use on all of our apparel. But then there's actually 2 other drawings that we own, and sort of we use them occasionally in like playful settings and stuff. But we landed on the main logo as our our main mark. But then we've got these other 2 that we sometimes break out. So.
Well, as someone who went to school as a jackrabbit, we always appreciated the aesthetic, and I have a lot of buddies with a tattoo that looks very similar to the Tracksmith logo that we call the Dead Bunny logo. I'm curious. You were mentioning some of the first products and the first piece of apparel and how that and how the logos looked on it. What was that first piece of apparel that you held in your hand?
We launched with 5 pieces. There was the singlet and the race shorts. There was a spike bag, and then there were our gray boy tee and a Longfellow short. So those were the first 5 products. I don't remember if the Longfellow or the Van Cortlandt singlet, which one actually sort of showed up from the factory first, but those were probably the 2 sort of most symbolic products at launch. So the Van Cortlandt singlet, is probably our most recognizable piece. It's got sort of the sash, the bold sash across the chest. And so that was one of the first products. And the Longfellow short is like a secret gem that some people know about in our line. It uses probably the most incredible fabric ever to be used in a running garment out of Switzerland, and it doesn't look like a running short at all. It's a longer short, and the story of that short is I ran the Penn Relays steeplechase. I took a year off from school, so I raced unattached for a year. You couldn't redshirt in the Ivy League, so if you wanted more eligibility back then, you could take time off. Nowadays, people do a 5th year at other universities, so I took a year off. I was injured, and then I got back in shape, and I ran the Olympic development steeplechase at the Penn Relays. And I was an idiot, and I ran in long mesh shorts. They were basically like basketball shorts, and they kept getting wet, every water jump. And, at Penn, the water jumps on the outside and in the corner of the stadium. And so after a few laps, when I would come into the water jump, the crowd there was chanting long shorts at me every time I came through. So I just always had this thing where I just wanted to make a pair of long shorts. I wasn't a short guy back then. And I wanted a long pair of shorts that I could run in. And so that was kind of the impetus for the Longfellow.
I love it. That's a great story. Well,
I think I may have outkicked Floriani in that race at the end. We've got to check that. Our PRs in the steeplechase are very close, and I think maybe he has me by a second, but I may have gotten him in that race.
Nice,
Matt. I'm curious. We talked about the name. We talked about, we've talked about fonts. We've talked about names. We've talked about the logo. But I think one of the most iconic and maybe the most identifiable, kind of pieces for someone to identify Tracksmith out of a crowd is the sash across the chest. And I'm curious, what is the kind of the historical background to making that such a integral part of your singlets?
There were 2 main inspirations for that when we started the design. One was my father-in-law ran track in high school and college, and he ran in North Attleboro, actually where I am now, and at UConn. And he still had all of his old gear. So I have his UConn t-shirt and sweatshirt, where he ripped the sleeves off. He was a sprinter and a high jumper and long jumper, so not a distance guy. But I had his North Attleboro singlet from literally high school in the 60s. And it's this beautiful white, I think it was Wilson or Champion, I can't remember, white singlet with this beautiful red satin sash sewn on top of the garment, right? Because that's just how they did it. And it had the NA and the, up on the chest for North Attleboro. So that always, I just loved that garment. And then, having run in the Ivy League, the Cornell tradition is really unique too, where if you score a point at the HEPS championship, they would actually sew a sash over the C on your jersey. Nowadays, they just screen print them. It's not as symbolic as it used to be, but it used to be that they would sew this satin sash over the C. So those just really, those were really strong inspirations for me and for us in that early design. And so that's kind of where that came from. And, obviously we did it in our way and in a different way because construction techniques and different things have changed since then. But that was really the inspiration behind it.
Matt, I think we've gotten into this very clear identity and branding that Tracksmith owns, and you do it so well, and you fostered it so well over these last few years. However, I'm curious, because it is such a focused, clear, distinct vision, and you don't go outside of those borders very often. Is it sometimes almost difficult to create new product because you have such strict brand guidelines?
Absolutely. Design is easy when you add. It's very easy to just add a lot of things. And I think the running industry as a whole for 2 decades sort of fell into that trap, where mainly driven by the shoe wall in a sporting goods store, where you have all these shoes on a wall. And even at Puma, I remember the constantly talked about the perceived value. We have to add the perceived value, and that's why every shoe has all of these overlays and lots of stuff going on. And every little part of the shoe is branded with some technology name that's, it's all foam. The midsoles are all foam. Everything's pretty much the same. So design like with restraint is actually quite hard. So it does get challenging to design new product, think about new product, but at the same time, running, the requirements of running, and especially in New England where we have 4 very distinct seasons, there's plenty of opportunity and room to create new products and still have them fall within the brand guidelines. And but yeah, there are, for every one product that we launch, there are 10 to 20 that, fell to the wayside because it just didn't in the end sort of feel right or get through the filters that we put things through.
Can you take us into kind of a meeting room of when you guys are discussing product and kind of the next cycle, right? And you see, although that you have this vision, right? And it's, if you want to call it a strict vision and guideline, you see these other brands creating things, you see the trends in the market. And like you say, you're trying not to chase trends, but I have to assume when you're in those meetings and you're like, hey, what's a creative idea? You're some of the inspiration has to come from what's out there, what's selling. You see the extreme example is the shoe debacle with, the carbon plated shoes and all the brands chasing to try to get there. Right. So can you kind of take us into what those discussions look like with your team, and how are you taking in all ideas and then filtering out like, hey, this is too far outside of what we are, versus something that maybe is a little outside, but gets in and gets into that consideration?
So our process usually starts one of 2 ways. The primary way, and it's very different than how it works at the other brands, is we are very much a culturally led and sort of editorial storytelling led organization. And so normally what will happen is, at a normal company, my time at Puma, product and marketing are separate and on totally different timelines. And so the product team is working on something, and, by the time it sort of is brought to the marketing team, it's too late to sort of change anything. And so then the marketing team is sort of can get really creative about how to sell that thing, but they didn't necessarily have any input into that thing. And I will say Nike is the exception here. They have, every few years they're able to get everyone in the organization rallied around a single concept, and it they execute it flawlessly. The 4% Alpha Fly, being the perfect example of that. Whether or not that's actually how it happened, or whether it was a product innovation or a marketing push, who knows? But we start very collaboratively, and we usually come at it from that sort of like cultural or storytelling perspective. So That could be an inspiration in the sport. That could be an event that we participated in. We've done, for example, our relay collection last year was inspired by the greatest Penn Relays performances of all time. So we just have so much more flexibility to explore creatively those things that at a bigger brand, it would just never happen. And then on the other side of that, we also approach things from a functional standpoint. And so again, leaning on New England and 4 seasons and what do we need in the fall and how's that different from the winter, and material research and material science is something that we put a big focus on. And we've been able to create and develop and work with textile partners to create some of the most innovative and we feel the highest quality fabrics in the industry. And so those two things, it's usually one of those two things. We're usually either attacking it from a functional perspective, working through material choice and things like that, or we're drawing inspiration from something within the sport historically or culturally, and bringing it to life that way.
Interesting. I want to ask you about how you work on a price point for these kind of things. And, it's interesting. So my fiance, I took her to Boston right before the pandemic hit. We're trying to plan our wedding up in New England for this summer. And so we're in Boston, and I took her to Tracksmith, and I didn't know how that would go over because she doesn't come from running. She's worked, deep in the cheer industry for years. And so she thinks us runners are crazy, but she also loves us. But I took her to Tracksmith because I wanted to see if you were there and see, if any of the guys were in there that I knew. And she was actually really excited about the stuff in there. I think part of it was because it, had a higher price point. And she's like, running, like nice running gear. This seems cool. I could, see myself in some of this. So anyway, just a knock that some outsiders really enjoyed your product. But on the other end, you started focusing on men's apparel, and being a male runner, I also know we're very cheap. And we a lot of times look for the cheapest road to shoe, apparel, whatever it is with gear. And so how was that met when you launched, and how has that been as you guys have evolved in terms of the pricing, understanding the customer and what they're looking for? And I'm sure there's a balance of, you can lower the price and get more sales, but you're also have a brand here and a way you're trying to execute.
Yeah. I mean, I'll stand by our product 100% all of the time. And we're at the premium end of the spectrum, but the quality is higher and the value that you get out of the product is better. And the reason for that is, and we're not perfect all of the time for sure, but what's different in how we've approached it is that the traditional model in the running industry is very wholesale driven. And so you are giving up roughly 50% of if it's $100, you're giving $50 to whoever is reselling that product for you. And obviously the Warby Parkers and the Bonoboses of the world brought the idea of a direct-to-consumer model. And when those brands started at the early days of that, it was much more about, by cutting out the wholesale margin, we're going to bring you relatively similar product, but for a cheaper price. And when I started really digging into the materials specifically, and post Puma and started researching, there are amazing fabrics and textiles and trims that are in the market, and they're used in other categories, but they're not used in running. And the reason is because they are more expensive, and they're more expensive because they are better. And so what we sort of decided is, we'll take that direct model because it's what we believed in and what we wanted to do. We wanted to be in control of our brand narrative and our brand story. But what if we reinvested the money that normally would have gone to a wholesale, margin structure and put it into the raw materials? And so, we do use fabrics and raw materials that are objectively better. And again, that's not the case always across the board. In our range, we we have shorts in the $40 range and tops in the $40 range. But yeah, we also go up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we have a decent spectrum. But I will say that when we started 5.5 years ago, we were out there in terms of price, in terms of what maybe people like you were used to seeing. But as time has gone by, and I'm not saying we are responsible for this, but if you look at the apparel from the other brands, I think in some ways we've given them permission to increase their prices. And where we used to think, yeah, we're at the expensive end, we don't always feel that way. And sometimes we look at other brands that have things that we know the product is not as good as ours, and it's either equally priced or priced higher. And so I'll never apologize for our prices. We really are extremely considered and thorough and care deeply about the quality of the product that we put out there. And like I said, we spend a lot of time on material research and science. And that's what we put out there.
Matt, I mean, every decision for every piece of product seems very, methodical and done through the lens of a very specific person and a very specific team. But I wonder if when you guys start talking about, what's in the future and growth, and I wonder, you talk about you're basically just direct to consumer, online, e-com built. You're in a very small, very specific amount of especially running shops across the country. However, let's say Ed Stack from Dick's Sporting Goods calls you tomorrow and says, hey, we want a competitor to Lululemon in our stores, and we want to put Tracksmith at a end cap on 200 stores. What is the consideration tree there? Would you be open to that, or does that get murky as far as the ethos of your brand?
That is a great question, and we have considered that. We've talked about that. We've been approached by not Ed Stack, but some other larger retailers than your traditional mom and pop or independent running store. We haven't, other than we sell on Mr. Porter, which is a global e-commerce website, because we can't fulfill demand outside of the US as well as we wish we could, and they have distribution in Asia and Europe, and so that's our one sort of international partner. But that it doesn't feel right now. I don't know if and when the time will feel right for something like that. I think, you use Lululemon as an example. I mean, a lot of people don't know they started actually with a bit of wholesale business. When they would enter a market, they would work with local yoga studios. But, as they've grown, they've gone almost 100% direct. And, Rafa, the cycling brand, is another example where they did do a little bit of wholesale early on, but predominantly have gone 100% direct. And so I think there are examples that we can look to where growth is possible without doing that. And so that decision of what does it do to your brand? Yes, it's going to increase top line revenue significantly, but at a lower margin and potentially at risk of diluting the brand in some way. And so, those are discussions and decisions we'll probably have to make over the next few years as we continue to grow. And I don't have a clear answer other than, if opportunities like that come along, we will definitely consider them. And so far we have not, done any of those types of partnerships so far.
Now, what would you say right now you feel is the kind of, I guess, the biggest challenge? You guys have been around for, did you say 5.5 years? I was going to say close to 7 years.
5.5, yeah.
5.5. So what, with everything you've gone through to this point and where you guys are at today. So 2 questions, maybe. Where are you at today, and what are your biggest challenges as you move forward?
I mean, things have been going, well. I mean, pre-COVID, things have been going really well. We're in a challenging time now, although we're diversified compared to some of our peers in the sense that we're predominantly online. We have one retail store that is closed, but a lot of brands rely on physical retail, and so we're in a little better position there. But it has been, going really well, and the challenges are really not much different than they have been, which is just general brand awareness. How do we continue to, tell more people about the brand? How do we continue to find ways to engage our customers? And when you're an online only business, there is still that hurdle of people who want to touch and feel a product. And so, we have been, I think, Ryan, you've been to a few of our pop-ups at the major marathons. That's something we started back in 2015 and continue to do today. This year, for example, we had plans to be, this year we had plans to be at all 6 majors. So Tokyo, London, and Boston in the spring, and then Berlin, Chicago, and New York in the fall. We've canceled or postponed, all of those. And those are great opportunities for us to be present physically, let people experience the brand, talk to, me or other people on the team, touch and feel the product, and so it's unfortunate that we're not able to do those things, but we have taken a very measured, conservative approach to our growth, and are focused on establishing the brand. The product range has grown. The unit economics of the business have gotten better. I think, again, going back to the price thing, our margins, people probably, sometimes think that it's expensive, but the margins are not better than any other running brand because we are using more expensive raw materials. But the unit economics of the business have gotten better. And so, we're just really looking forward to the next few years to be able to continue to grow. Expansion maybe in terms of that physical presence. We were really looking forward to the Olympics this year. We had some pretty big plans in terms of, brand marketing and brand campaigns, but we'll just, push everything to next year. But we're just excited and building our foundation. So
when you're talking about brand awareness, it's interesting because, as my role at Flow Sports has changed, there was I was at every event every year, and now, I will still make it to a lot of the big events, but sometimes there's maybe a year in between. And so I was at the 2019 Boston Marathon, and I think it had been a year or two since I had made it to the race. And one of the things that stood out to me was the days leading to the marathon, just while I'm walking down the streets, down Boylston, down Newbury, how many people were wearing Tracksmith, right? And I was just like, whoa. I was like, this is pretty striking. There were huge group runs. And so it seems like you guys have focused on building a community. It seems like that community is building. And really, Alex, you and I have talked about it a number of times. Then even fast forward to 2020 with the Olympic trials and the amount of people wearing Tracksmith, it's becoming more visible to walk the streets and see it and be like, I can say that's Tracksmith. That guy's wearing Tracksmith. He's running at me. That's a Tracksmith thing. 2 or 3 years before that, maybe I would have seen a person or two. I probably knew the guy wearing it. And where now it seems like it's really, that community is really growing. I mean, is that true? Are you guys seeing that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's like, I remember it seemed like it took a really long time until I saw Tracksmith in the wild that wasn't somebody I knew, but then it just like, it happened all of a sudden. And, it's weird now. It's hard to go for a run along the Charles River and not see someone that I don't know wearing Tracksmith, or to go to Central Park or Prospect Park in New York City and not see a Tracksmith, at least one piece of Tracksmith, which is amazing. I mean, it's so, I take a lot of pride in that, and it's such a cool feeling. And I geek out about it. I never approach people and say, hey, the funniest one, actually, I was last summer, I was on the Cape, and I was doing a run, and I finished at the beach, and at the top of the dunes, this woman was standing there, and she goes, "Oh, Tracksmith, I love that brand." And I was like, "Oh, thanks. Yeah, me too." And she's like, "You a runner?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a runner." She's like, "Are you like an ambassador for them?" And I was like, "Yeah,
you could say that."
Yeah, I'm an ambassador. So I eventually told her, and we had a great conversation. But yeah, it's so neat to see that, and yeah, it's been a lot of fun to see that growth and to see it out in the wild a lot more.
And then you had her pull out her phone and you showed her where she could buy it online, and she grabbed a singlet right there.
Exactly.
Matt, I think, we mentioned the Olympic trials moment, and I just think that was such an unbelievable moment because, the optics of it is one thing, but actually getting people to buy in and be involved in this program. And you had the athlete support program, but respectfully, like the idea of getting singlets on elites or aspiring elites and giving out free product, it's not a new idea. I mean, every brand over years has been chomping at the bit to try to get on the feet or on the torso of these elite athletes. And let's be honest, like if you're a trials person, like it's just the elite running network is so small. Like most athletes have a connect. Somebody that will hook you up with a singlet here and there, a pair of kicks here and there, a rep, owner of a specialty shop, whatever. We all have those connections. Everyone on the start line has those connections, but they still went to Tracksmith. They still invested in the brand. And I'm wondering why was Tracksmith finally able to crack the nut of breaking into that aspiring elite field, this field that is probably the most influential in our community, because other brands could have done it. Everybody's got apparel, but they also have footwear. I almost wonder if the footwear is what is the hamstring that almost doesn't let these athletes really embrace these sort of programs, because we've seen them before. Why was Tracksmith's program so successful?
The footwear angle probably is part of it, right? You had the 4%, and a lot of athletes wanted to wear that. But that's not the main reason or the only reason by any stretch. I mean, I don't know. I feel like you can apply this to probably anything, but when I think about starting Tracksmith, it's like you need luck, timing, and execution, and you can probably only have 2 of those at a time. You need at least 2 of those to work, to be successful. And so we executed. Our team is, again, extremely talented team that executes at a very high level, very, very consistently. But there was just a timing thing that also was in our favor, where when we announced the program, or when we thought about the program, it wasn't the goal, not the goal, but we never thought we would have 138 athletes at the trials wearing Tracksmith. It was 1 in 5 athletes were in Tracksmith apparel. What it was we had 3 employees on our team who had qualified for the trials, and we had some athletes that we had used in photo shoots who either had qualified or were trying to qualify. And so it just came out of this idea of okay, how do we support the people we know in our networks, the people we care about? And, we also talked to Ryan and Des Linden with their coffee company and sort of said, hey, gear and coffee is sort of 2 essentials for any runner. And so we sort of started with our own network and announced the program. And the timing piece that I'm talking about is, grandmas, CIM, these races that went from a few years ago or to the last Olympic cycle 4 years ago being great races, but not these gold standards for, let's call them elite amateurs, where they want to go get their qualifying time. But CIM had grown to mythic proportions, and so had grandmas. And so we just had a couple races in a row where a lot of athletes went, and a lot of them got the standard. And at those races, some of those people maybe were already part of the program. Some of those people were, Tracksmith employees or friends of Tracksmith employees. And so all of those things just kind of came together at the right time, where, when we launched the program, we had 6 people, and then it grew to 12, and then it was like 30, and we were like blown away. And then it snowballed. And, again, execution and timing were really in our favor. And, is for me personally, probably my proudest Tracksmith moment to date. To be at that level and to be able to, it's such a small role that we played in terms of supporting those athletes. We gave them a quarterly stipend for gear and the coffee. But we, I think, made them feel like they were a part of something. We had a hospitality suite with, physiotherapists and chiropractors and massage therapists and, snacks and food. They could bop in and out any time of day that they wanted. And, it was sort of like that professional athlete treatment for the amateurs in that race. And so we built great relationships with a lot of athletes, and just a wonderful experience for us as a brand.
Was there ever a moment yet you thought you weren't going to have enough singlets?
Oh, the backstory, we literally almost put somebody on a plane to fly and hand carry them down there. It got that close. We had an issue with the fabric. The color was bleeding. We had to change the fabric last minute. It was, it was kind of crazy. And yeah, there was definitely a moment where we didn't think that we would have the gear. And you have to remember too, this was like end of February in the US. I feel like Atlanta, the trials was like the last normal event any of us in the running industry went to, but in Asia, coronavirus had hit a lot earlier than that. And so there was just a lot going on behind the scenes trying to get the product there to the athletes, but we made it happen. We got it done.
In your description of this, this kind of moment at the trials, you use the word elite amateurs. You've had some announcements recently with some athletes that we would consider pro that announced they're going amateur. So I'm curious, what is this amateur meaning here from the Tracksmith perspective?
We've always used that word. The sport was built on the amateur spirit. We talk about it mostly in context of the spirit of being an amateur, doing it for the love, not for some other reason. And, our sport has a long history of amateurism, and then the shady period where it was pseudo amateurism, and then professionalism. And, but that OTQ program for us, for example, the 138 athletes almost across the board, they all had full-time or part-time or relatively demanding jobs, and that to me is very inspirational and motivating to sort of see someone who's a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer. We had someone that was an archivist at a museum. They're working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and still running 242 in the marathon or 218 in the marathon. And, they're very influential in their local communities, in some ways, maybe more so than the top of the sport, because those athletes are a lot of times unrelatable and inaccessible. And so, for us, that's just something that, we don't have the resources or the budget to try to compete with sponsoring the best athletes in the world who are consistently going to make it to the Olympic Games. So we've always sort of said what makes sense for us as a brand, where we are today, what's the strategy that we can, execute against that's going to work for us, fits the brand ethos. And so that's how like the OTQ program happened, and then evolved to obviously, hiring Nick Willis and Mary Cain.
Yeah. And can you, I'd love to get into that a little bit, because, the announcement with Nick and Mary, the going amateur and what that means. Can you explain what that program looks like? And on the outside, is it any different than an athlete that is hired by a company and is training, training for whatever it might be, the trials, the games, the US championships, whatever that might be?
What's completely different is that they are full-time Tracksmith employees. They are in our regular meetings. They're contributing. They have jobs. They have roles and responsibilities that they're going to be evaluated against. And what that makes it very different than the traditional model. The traditional model is obviously, a sponsorship agreement, a 1099, you're a contractor, you have appearance fees, you have, not appearance fees, but appearance days in your contract. You have to make 4 appearances on behalf of the brand. You have to run this race or that race. If you end up top 10 in the world, you get a bonus. If you don't end up top 10 in the world, you get reduced. If you're injured, too bad, you lose half your salary. I mean, it had been a very cutthroat sponsorship model. And then a few brands and individuals have obviously started advocating for different types of contracts and models for the athletes. So that's also happened. And so what's different for us is that, these are literally employees in the organization. We are already a pretty remote organization. We have, an employee in London and Portugal and Pittsburgh and Philly. And, so they're not in Boston full time, but a lot of our team isn't in Boston full time. But they basically, the way it sort of came to be is we identified a year ago a strategy, a 3-year, 4-year plan for the brand and how we were going to achieve those goals. And from that plan comes, a headcount plan. We're going to hire this type of role and that type of role. And so these weren't, we didn't do these because Nick and Mary are fast athletes. We literally identified a strategy and the types of roles that we needed in the organization. And when I started talking to Nick first and then to Mary, their skill set and their passion and what they wanted to do outside of their running fit perfectly to what we were looking for. And, they literally interviewed like any other employee would and went through that process. And, for us, we've added 2 amazing human beings to the organization that we think are going to add a lot of value. They also happen to be fast runners. But to be honest, if Nick wakes up tomorrow and calls me and says, I'm going to retire, that's totally fine. I have zero restrictions, 0 expectations that he continues to run as a, professional track athlete on the circuit. And same with Mary.
So if he retires from running, that doesn't mean he retires from Tracksmith.
Exactly. Yeah, he's an employee here, until he quits or we fire him. He's working at Tracksmith.
So for this role of this program, if I'm an athlete and I'm looking for sponsorship, is Tracksmith an avenue for me, or is Tracksmith only an avenue really when there's a position available that fits my skill set?
Yeah, the latter. This approach is not scalable overnight because we have 23 full-time employees. We can't take on 10 athletes. That would, we would 50% increase in our headcount. We can't do that. For us, yeah, this isn't like this isn't like tech reps or ambassadors. These are full-time positions within the organization. They're not figureheads. They're not ceremonial. And both Mary and Nick wanted that. They wanted that challenge. They wanted to feel part of something. They obviously what's unique for them is they're getting healthcare. They're getting a regular salary. We happen to pay twice a month at Tracksmith. The old model, you get paid maybe once a quarter as an athlete. So there's more consistency there. They also get stock options in the organization as all employees do. And so it's just it's a approach that worked for us, but maybe doesn't work for other brands and frankly can't work for a lot of athletes today. We can't, again, you have to have some skill set beyond running fast for that model to work.
I'm wondering, do you have the next headcount position that comes up that can fit this program? Is there like an auction? Do we auction it off?
Yeah, that sounds like a Nick Simmons. That sounds like a Nick Simmons idea right there.
Well, I mean, and I guess in all seriousness, these positions earmarked for employees that are also athletes, or are they competing against someone that's there for a full-time role that's not an athlete as well?
Absolutely. And pre Nick and Mary, I'll give you, our team, everyone loves running on the team, but the ability level is quite broad, right? We have both ends of the spectrum, but one of our first employees, Eric Ash, is a 2:17 marathoner, and he's now head of all of our customer experience and customer accounts. Lou Serafini came on board as our basically running the track house in Boston, and has grown and been promoted into a larger role within the organization. He ran sub 4 minutes in the mile and also 2:17 or so in the marathon. Jason Ayre is our controller. He's a 2:19 marathoner. He's probably the fastest controller, on the books anywhere in the world. He's a finance guy.
Like it.
Yeah. So, that's, I'm sure there are stories at Nike and Puma and Adi in the early days too, where, you attract people in the beginning who are really into the sport and into what you're doing. And so as we grow, I'm sure that dynamic of our team is going to change significantly. But right now, we do, those are the types of people that we've found within our networks, and been able to build a really strong team by doing that. But it by no way is that a requirement, or, we're looking for the best people for the organization, not the fastest people. It just so happens that some of them are very fast.
Matt, I'm going to take the Nick's situation to the extreme here. Let's say, and like this is a great scenario. Let's say he makes the Olympics for next in Tokyo, 2021 summer. What does his involvement look like as an employee, and what is the branding and celebration / marketing around him look like for Tracksmith, especially as we start to explore new sort of sponsorship rulings, and just things are evolving, especially for what athletes can say and what sort of marketing you can do around athletes and sponsors who aren't technically Olympic sponsors. I'm just curious at how Tracksmith's going to approach his duties as an employee, and then his marketability around 2021 Olympic Games.
So, I mean, his duties as an employee don't change. I mean, we have the same, our culture is, we work hard, but people have a lot of flexibility and freedom. So, if Eric's in his build up, the last 3 weeks before a marathon, he's taking more time off. He's not working as hard. So it comes in cycles the same way it does, the way you train. And so, if Nick makes the Olympics and is over in Tokyo for 3 weeks at the, training camp for New Zealand, and then racing, that's totally fine. And we're equipped and nimble enough to sort of be able to adjust. And, it's just kind of how we operate already anyway. So, so that won't really change. I mean, we would likely, regardless of Nick makes the Olympics or not, we would hope to have a presence in Tokyo anyway. We've done these pop-ups at the major marathons. We had planned this year to be in Tokyo for the Tokyo Marathon in February, and then hopefully to come back in August for the Olympics and have some type of presence on the ground there. So Nick would be doing double duty, living in the Olympic Village, and also, being at the store or the pop-up and executing with the marketing team the way Lou or anyone else on our team would. The celebration and the marketing, and even the gear. I mean, the reality is, if he gets to the, first round of the 1500s or makes it to the final, he's not wearing Tracksmith. I don't even know right now who the sponsor is for New Zealand Federation, but we knew that. I mean, my days at Puma and working in this industry, I know those rules and how all of that works. And again, that wasn't a consideration for us with signing Nick, and his spot in the Olympics isn't even guaranteed. He may not make the team. That's a possibility. So I haven't dug into the new, Rule 40s. It's not something we as a brand have had to worry about in the past. I dealt with it a lot in my Puma days, but to be honest, I don't have an answer for that part of it yet. What the communication will be leading up to it, or if he did make it, any type of like celebratory message. I'll leave that to the creative team to sort of figure that out. But yeah, it hasn't been something we've been thinking a lot about.
So I'm curious if I could maybe lobby. I mean, really, it's not relevant for me, but lobby for like an Olympic vacation in my in my career. If I make the Olympics, could I get an extra 3 weeks? Maybe Mark would grant that to me. I think he would probably grant me more than that if I made the Olympics, because it's kind of impossible. But
yeah.
But no, I mean, it's interesting to hear you describe kind of the ebbs and flows of training and competing, and how that can coincide with work. Is there ever a time where that ebb and flow of like what's needed and maybe what growth of a certain cycle and the competition of that athlete's cycle where they don't match up, and you're like, hey, we actually can't afford to have you take the next week, kind of chill, and we need you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that situation could arise and has. I'll go back to Lou as an example too. I mean, when he broke 4 minutes in the mile, he was working his ass off. We were in the midst of a lot of executions happening in Boston, and he was working really long days and really long nights and weekends. And, some people I think thrive with having I'll call them distractions, having something else to motivate them in their day other than their training, and just thinking about training nonstop. And not everyone's like that, but, Lou is like that. Eric's like that, Jason, Jeff, we have people on the team who, they appreciate having something else to keep their mind off of training. And so I think Nick and Mary are both looking for that as well. I think they're at different stages of their career for sure. And so it's a different approach for each of them, but that similarity I think exists. So, again, we're super flexible as a team. Like, everyone can step up. People can go away, and, we don't miss a beat. And, that's just, that's how we've built the team, and I can get super involved too. I mean, part of my role is like filling in the holes when there's a hole to be filled. So if Nick's got to go do something for 2 weeks, and, we need someone to do what he was going to do, any of us can step in and do that. So I'm not really worried about it, but it is a good point. And yes, certainly that's a possibility that something like that could happen down the road. But
before we let you go, Matt, I wanted to kind of get an idea of the roadmap. It sounds like you guys plan things out pretty well in advance, and, seeing what you did at the trials and now seeing what you're doing with Mary and Nick, what is the roadmap on the sponsorship side? Is there a goal to be able to get to the point where you can support the traditional sponsorship, or is that not part of the plan?
It's not part of the plan now. I mean, I think with Nick and Mary, we don't have any plans to do more of this in the near future. There's no current conversations happening. We're not thinking about it. We wanted to do it, and we found the two athletes that it made sense to do this with. And we even just from a headcount perspective, we only have one job currently open at the organization. So I don't know what the future holds. I mean, it is a little bit hard, right? I think a lot of people in the industry that have been following this are wondering, like, what really are they doing? And it's hard because we can't tell you everything that we have planned as a brand, in the next year, because we don't want to give away everything that we have planned. But I will say that their roles within the organization fit with our strategic objectives for the next 2 to 3 years. And so will you see, that come to life a little bit more and understand it more clearly in 6 months or a year? A little bit maybe has changed because of coronavirus. I think so. But, I worked at Puma, and I was there when we had Bolt, and the guy that runs sports marketing at Puma, Pascal Rolling, was, I think, one of the smartest guys in the industry, because he was the first person to identify that if you could get the federation, then when you show up at a world champs or an Olympics, they're wearing the singlet or the top, right? And so, Jamaica is a great example where Puma signed Jamaica very early on when Nike and some other brands were paying Asafa Powell and some of the other athletes a lot of money. But at the Olympic Games, you saw the Puma cat on Asafa Powell. And that was really, really smart and strategic. And so to do sports marketing well with athletes, I think there are 2 strategies that can work really well. It's quantity or it's quality. Or if you're lucky, you can have both. But Nike sponsors a ton of athletes, and they pretty much guarantee that even if some get injured or some don't perform, they're going to have enough athletes competing at the highest level of the sport that you're going to see a lot of swooshes on a track, in a cross-country race, in a road race. And Puma took the approach of quantity. Is there something strategically that they could do differently that would allow them to compete with Nike without having the resources of Nike to sign all of these athletes? And that worked with the federation strategy. It was Jamaica, it was Sweden, it was Uganda. And then also obviously getting lucky and having Usain Bolt, but that was because of the relationship with the federation. So it's a long way of saying we are way off from being able to try to do either of those 2 strategies. And I firmly believe you've got to do one or the other. So we're just sort of like over here doing what works for us as a brand right now. And we'll do this for a couple of years. And as we grow, we'll be able to sort of reevaluate and see what maybe comes next. But we're focused on this for now, because I don't think we can do it any other way.
Well, I think this is a good spot to be right now in our interview. I mean, I think just being able to see your path and your growth and where you guys are at. I mean, I remember when you got your space in Boston, you only had part of it, and then all of a sudden you had the whole building. And I remember that was kind of a whoa moment for me when I was talking to you. And so it's been cool to kind of see you guys progress and that community grow, and just the news recently too. So we're excited to see this growth continue, where it leads you guys, and excited to see how you're going to use your new assets and Mary and Nick over the next 6 to 12 months. So we really appreciate you coming on and giving us that insight, Matt, and sharing your story with us.
No worries. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking so much time too.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be back in Boston in the fall and get to see you for some fun events.
I know. It'll be interesting to see what sort of that first running event is that we can all get to again. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what it'll be. I hope it's Boston, but we'll see.
Well, we'll be ready for it, whatever it is. So
yeah.
Thanks so much again. And be safe up there, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Coming out of a great conversation with Matt Taylor, co-founder and CEO of Tracksmith there. And, Alex, me personally, I could listen to early year stories from a guy like that all day, because it resonates so much with my life. I mean, the early content stories and calling people to go film them, and how you were doing it, and how you were getting videos together and up on the internet, and how you even telling people how to see it. I mean, just you live through those growing pains, and it's just, that stuff is always, I can always geek out on that stuff with people. I mean, going into just the opportunity for a guy to like fall into a position with a brand that happens to, be representing a guy when he blows up and becomes the biggest name in the history of a sport. I mean, you don't get much more unique opportunities than that. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And man, just, yeah, the stories he has and the experience he has, at Puma and working with Bolt are ones that I'm sure he won't forget. But in general, what I loved about the interview is just stories in general, right? The early day stories, the Bolt stories and Puma stories, but then hearing about the brand of Tracksmith, the hair how they came to the logo, the sash that you had asked about. I mean, it just brings you so much more connected to a person and to a brand when you understand those things. And I love that.
Totally. And it makes you appreciate it even more. Like when he mentioned that like the illustrator was like a storybook illustrator or something like that, I was like, yes, like Alice in Wonderland, like you like totally, like it crystallizes that moment to you. And you just appreciate the toil and like the crazy, like the real, like how much they, like how
it's like all the thought that it's like
they own every single tiny decision. Was just pined over for a long time, and you can see it in everything they push out. I love the moment we started talking about design. He said design with restraint, and I think that's something we talk about. When I was at Adidas, we talked about all the time. Like when you look at it used to be this it was like visible tech all the time, right? Like you need to see this new technology, and now there's this overlay, and both of those things are going to have two very distinct colors. All right, like it was just more tech, more colors, and like Tracksmith was just kind of like this wave that said no, like we can be thoughtful about this, we can be minimal about this, we can again design with restraint, and you can still have a technological eliteness to you, even if your product looks like it's totally stripped down. And I think that is just like such a cool notion, and like you can see tons of people have embraced that sort of trend.
Yeah. On the the sponsorship side, it was interesting to get his take, right? His background and experience with Puma and bigger brands and where they're at. What I appreciated about what Matt said about really the recent announcements with Nick and Mary is that they kind of know where they are, and they don't have on the roadmap like, oh yeah, we're going to go out and get the biggest athlete. No, this was a very specific opportunity that fit some headcount positions they needed to fill with athletes that had the skill sets and the passion for what those roles were. And there was a win-win there. Right. And I think, you hear like, Nick and Mary make the announcement, and you're probably wondering, oh, is Tracksmith starting to sponsor people? It's like, no, this is a very specific thing. And I think it's interesting in a couple ways. One is hopefully it gets athletes to think about their careers. And, when you're not always going to be a competitive runner. You can always be a runner, but at some point, what is next, and what is that transition, and how do you set yourself up for opportunities like this? If this is kind of what you look for, we see a lot of runners that transition into brands, but even at other companies, it has to fit with what the role is that's available at the time. Because you're a runner doesn't mean you're just going to get the job, right? You have to have a passion and some kind of experience, or at least background with something you've done in your career outside of just what's on the track. And then, I think the other thing that I thought was interesting about it was, the quality versus quantity thought in future sponsorship, and whether it's them or another brand, like how do you approach that?
Totally. Yeah. Like it was interesting. Like these are some absolutes in our sport that we all talk about all the time. Like you're either an athlete or you're an employee. You either sponsor lots of people or you only sponsor a specific group of people. Like you can only sponsor athletes or you can sponsor federations. So again, this is kind of the ethos of this podcast. How do we start? Like there is a gray area that there cannot be an absolute on one end or the other, right? We can move into this more gray area that is healthier for both brands and athletes, right? You can be an employee and an athlete, and you don't have to sponsor a ton of athletes. There doesn't have to be this quantity and just like a war of attrition. Maybe we'll get somebody to succeed at this marathon, or like, hey, we'll just toss a bunch of money at this federation, or like let's toss a bunch of money at the X large scale city marathon. There has to be a middle ground here, and those are the conversations we are trying to push forward on this podcast and the people we're trying to bring on. And so if if you appreciate this content and you have ideas or you want to push the momentum forward, please reach out to us. Alex with Stripes on social. Ryan, what are you at? Ryan Fenton?
Oh man,
social?
Ryan Fenton 10 on Insta, Ryan M Fenton on the twit. Sorry, I'm not consistent like you are.
But anyways, like, we want to keep these stories going, and we appreciate your ideas. And so, if you could reach out and subscribe, leave a review, let us know what sort of stories or people we should be reaching out to. But we want to have those conversations. We want to have the conversations that are happening beneath the grandstand. So appreciate you guys joining us this week. Reach out, subscribe, check out some of our other episodes, and we'll see you next week.